Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of Asatru, which I can really only do an overview of today before we get into the nitty-gritty in other videos, we need to talk about the people that these religions were based off of. I give you the Northmen, the Norsemen, or the Vikings. Oh, the Viking era was about 750 AD to about 1100 AD, and spanned pretty much from North America to the Middle East, from the northern part of Africa all the way to Scandinavia and parts of Russia. They pretty much touched down and raided on every coastline in northern, western, and parts of South Europe, a lot of the Middle East, parts of Russia, which was then Rus, and North Africa. They didn't necessarily settle in all of these locations, but they did have a significant impact. The name Viking was actually thought to originate from Vik, Norway, which is a big bay and was a port at the time for trading and bartering. Viking was not a people per se, but a profession. It was any seabound expedition and could include trading, bartering, or raiding as they've been made famous for. Those who did the Viking were Vikinger. Those who were in big groups were Vikingar. Many of the people who we think as Vikings were actually farmers. It was very expensive to build, maintain, and crew ships, and so many times the people known as Vikings were actually just people hired by jarls and local leaders who actually could afford the ships to do the raiding and whatnot for their regions. It's a common misconception that the Vikings were racist. This is very much not true. Even in places that they raided and eventually settled, they intermingled, bred with, and kept trades open with a lot of these other cultures and races, as can be seen in their grave sites and in the actual bones and whatnot of the graves from local areas. Now, as a whole, they did not care about what your color was. It really didn't matter. What did matter was your social status and your class. If you were a free person, regardless of if you were white, black, yellow, blue, purple, green, or orange, as long as you were a free person, you were on equivalent level and they would do business with you, they would chat with you, they would be civil with you, and in some cases, they would actually even marry in between them. If you were a slave, on the other hand, it was a completely different story. Even if you were a white slave that they had brought in from one of the raids, it did not matter. You were still seen as equivalent to the pigs outside in the pen. Viking women had many freedoms that other cultures through history could not even fathom. They, when married, were the household head. They controlled everything, including the finances and the slaves of the home. And they could also divorce their husbands under many terms. Of course, adultery was not one of those terms, but if the husband was bad in bed and was not fulfilling her sexual needs, she could in fact divorce him. Another misconception is that women in the Viking Age essentially grew up to become stay-at-home wives. Now, back then that was actually a very high level of prestige because that meant you controlled the entire homestead, but it was not entirely true. There are many figures that they've unearthed that showed women with swords. Now, traditionally, Valkyries were shown with spears, and so the fact that they are now showing women with swords is actually rather interesting and indicative of female warriors. This can be supported by finds such as the Birka woman grave, where she was actually surrounded by possessions and weapons equivalent to that of an elite warrior. Another interesting thing to note, and I will explain more on this later on in another video, is that females in the Viking Age were actually far more masculine than today in terms of physical appearance and build, and Viking men were actually more feminine. So the concept of the whole brosatru thing, which again I will go into on another video, is actually rather funny. And now to the religious part of Viking life. For them, religion was not a separate entity. It was their lifestyle. It was how they explained the world around them. Now, an important thing to remember is before I go into all of this stuff about Asatru, heathenism, neo-paganism, etc., is that this is all based on historical findings. There is nothing specifically from the Viking era that says any of this. Everything we have is pretty much written from people who came up to hundreds of years after this era actually happened, and were actually of other religions. Many of them are Christians, such as Snorri, and many of them are Muslim. And so while they have very detailed and interesting stories, we have to take everything with a grain of salt because it was not from the actual people of when it happened. Now again, I want to stress, there is no specific evidence that really pinpoints rituals and beliefs of the time. It was all interpretations from poems that were passed down orally over the years by mostly Christian monks in Iceland during the 13th century. That means at least 100 years after all of this happened. Now, when you take into consideration religious conversion as well as oral translation of myths in general, there's going to be some degradation in the stories. So again, you cannot take this stuff verbatim. Most of it is actually left up to personal interpretation of the stories. There is no dogmatic information in this system. You have to start on that level of understanding. So, let's get on to the religion of the Northmen, aka the Vikings. I would like to introduce you to Asatru, aka heathenism, neo-paganism, etc., etc. Now, an important part of this is that it is a modern religion. It is reconstructed from historical information that can be found. That means it is incomplete, possibly inaccurate, and left up to the interpretations of the people who follow it. So, again, it goes back to that whole personal thing. What you find from the texts that are about the source material may not be what the next person finds. And a very large and significant factor of this religion is that you need to do the work and read the material and figure out what it means for you. Unlike a lot of mainstream religions today, this is not something that you can just go in, have someone talk to you an hour a week, and then get to know the religion. There is a lot of homework that is involved in this religion to be a true religion. Now, of course, again, the kicker to that is that your homework may be different from someone else's homework. It just depends on what you're getting out of the source information. And, of course, along the lines, a lot of that gets degraded by other people. So the word Asatru is actually a two-part from Old Norse roots, Asa and Tru, and it means faith of the gods. Of course, in this case, it's the Norse gods of the pantheon that I will cover in later videos. But it was coined by Edvard Grieg in 1870 from an opera. Now, in the 1970s is when the actual Asatru religion was established by Sveinbjorn Bengtsson and a couple of his friends in Iceland. Of course, again, Icelandic Asatru, even though it has the same name, is in some cases very different from American Asatru and Asatru that you see in other parts of the world. It goes back to that whole regional thing where just because you have the same name or the same beliefs does not mean that the practices are always the same. The Icelandic Asaturafélagið, or the Pagan Association, was officially recognized in 1973, and they have no official dogma or scripture, but they highly recommend that you find your own personal interpretation of the information from the prose and poetic Eddas from the 13th century written by Snorri Sturluson. They are also a religion of peace and tolerance, which, as I will cover in another video, is actually rather contradictory to a lot of the originating American Asatru groups that come together. The American version of the Asatru organizations that formed did so through assemblies and alliances. These assemblies and alliances gathered a bunch of people together with the same mindsets about the old ways of the Norse. Not necessarily beliefs yet, though. Of course, a lot of these groups tended to harbor a lot of white supremacist and racist members, and they created a very large idea of folkish beliefs. Folkish beliefs are essentially when you believe that you must be of the bloodlines of the era that happened to really be able to understand or include yourself in the religion of this. So essentially, if you weren't of Scandinavian descent, you had no business having any involvement in any of this Asatru or heathenism. Of course, not everyone agreed with that. They saw the inclusionary and the equality aspect of the Northmen, and they broke off to create their own alliances and assemblies of equality, essentially. Again, so a big point in all of this is that these alliances and assemblies had to pretty much make up their own beliefs and rituals. And a lot of those have, over the years, become thought to be the dogma and or scripture of Asatru, specifically American Asatru. That is not true and goes back to the whole personal belief thing. You really can't have a dogma or a scripture that applies on a large scale in this religion because it goes against the information in the stories. The basis of the ideals are essentially free thought, honor, and duty. Of course, anything past that you can find as your own personal interpretation, good job. But again, so going back to these alliances and assemblies, the 9 noble virtues, the 9 charges, and the Assyrian Code of 9, I think it's called, they are not historical fact. They are interpretations gathered from information in the stories and the poems of the time and made into lists of what they consider the virtues of modern Asatru. Please do not take these as the dogma or scripture, because it is some other person's interpretation, and to just take it verbatim without questioning or doing the information gathering yourself is a disservice to the actual heart of the religion. So does that mean you can't follow the 9 noble virtues, the code, etc., etc.? No, you can follow them, but it is important to understand why you're following them. Are you following them because someone else told you to, or are you following them because they are also the virtues that you pulled from the stories and found to be personally inclusive to your belief and mindset? They may match up perfectly. You may only find 5 virtues of which you consider to be important to the religion. You may find 50. Again, it is personal and internal. Don't follow what other people say just because it's in a book. A good example of this is the hammer rite. Edred Thorson wrote about this hammer rite in his book, Futhark, trying to understand a couple rituals and stuff, specifically with runes and whatnot too. The hammer rite, at its core, just the base level, nothing against it, it is bullshit. It is made up. There is no historical accuracy to it. What it is a personal interpretation by this person in understanding that doing some sort of ritual, which in this case looks very similar to another religion, happens to build a barrier around an area where a ritual is supposed to take place to create a boundary of understanding. Essentially saying, I'm doing this motion, which means this space of which I am acknowledging is now sacred and the area of which we are going to perform this ritual. It's a personal thing. If you want to do a triangle, it doesn't matter. If you want to get a hula hoop and go around, it doesn't matter. The intent of the thing is essentially a personal desire to create a boundary. The hammer rite is one of those interpretations. Please, for the love of gods, do not think that it is historically accurate in its own. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to get everything in one video. This is just supposed to be a quick overview to give you an understanding of where it started, why it's a thing, and some quick misinterpretations that people have carried on through the years to be deemed as gospel and dogma and scripture, etc. Now, the important things that I need to stress about this, and this, if you take away anything from this, it's this. Asatru, heathenism, neo-paganism, etc., whatever name you want to call it by, is not a religion for those who don't want to put in the work and put their minds to work specifically. It is a free thought religion based off of stories. What that means is a lot of research, a lot of homework, and a lot of personal interpretation. You cannot rely on the words of other people and get by as a true religion. And I'd say the number one rule, the only rule in all of this, the number one thing to remember is don't be a dick. All of these stories, and I will go into it further down the line, the lessons always include consequences for people who act like dicks. To themselves, to their families, to their friends, to strangers on the road. All of these things have consequences, so don't be a dick. Number one rule. Aside from that, I will see you in the next video.